You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
You know, the subject of infrastructure is what came up when I asked our guest today if he'd like to be on the show. And I think the reply was something close to, sure, I love to talk about infrastructure anytime I can. I don't think you're going to get that response from every guest that you talk to or anybody that you talk to. But welcome to the show. Dan Nott is the author of the book Hidden Systems, which caught my eye, and I sat out in my front yard and burned through this book so fast. Loved every bit of it. Welcome, Dan. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, it's great to be here. So I am a cartoonist. I'm also a researcher and a teacher myself. I teach comics history. And for the past 4 or 5 years, I have been working on this book, exploring the histories of various infrastructures and how they relate to our daily lives and how they structure our society, and drawing it out in comic book form.
So I think the first question is why, going back to that infrastructure comment, why infrastructure? How did you pick this as, is it safe to say a rabbit hole to go down?
It's definitely a rabbit hole. I was really actually interested in visual metaphor. I had been drawing political cartoons for a while. I was always interested in ways of sort of combining current events and art. And I started drawing internet metaphors. If you think about like a lot of the strange metaphors we use to describe the internet, from a cloud to a series of tubes to an information superhighway. And I was like, wouldn't it be fun to just like draw those out and like kind of visualize how we sometimes think about something as complex as the internet using these visual metaphors. And then I thought it would be actually very cool to know how the internet actually works and compare that to how we think about it. And that's kind of how this started. And once I realized that this was actually a really interesting way of learning about the world around us, I applied that same formula to looking at the electric grid and how that was built and how that works, and also sort of the history of water systems.
You talk about that in the author's notes. So that really was the progression that you went through, starting with, you have like lines of light, which is about, you know, the internet and information transfer, and then power, and then water. So is that just kind of one kind of led itself into the next, the way you describe it like that?
Yeah, I think so. I think starting off with the internet and sort of moving into electricity and water, like, also has kind of a backwards chronology to it too.
That's what I was just going to follow up with. This is like, it's essentially the opposite of how it laid out for us. So starting basically, I guess, something that we can connect to and then work our way back is a way it is laid out.
Yeah, I think starting with the internet is something we maybe think about the most and is most present in our life, and then kind of taking a wider view and expanding outward from there, and understanding how the electric grid and water systems have also played into our daily lives.
So you had to do a lot of research for this, obviously. What was that research like? Were you going to find blueprints and cities and you have some history of how these things came to be as well, from people who were inventors to engineers and whatnot. What kind of research did you have to take? And were you flagged with, why is this guy looking at these things?
Yeah, I was always wondering about that. One of my favorite parts about this is just that process of discovery of particularly finding things that are actually around us all the time that we don't notice, and like kind of feeling like I'm seeing them for the first time because I just took them for granted so much. So while I did, I read a lot of books for this, but like my favorite way of really learning was talking to people who like work on these systems, and also kind of like going on field trips and noticing all of these systems out in the wild. Like I learned that my town has this like big central office that was originally built for the telegraph lines that came through White River Junction like 100 years ago. It was then upgraded for the phone system, and now is a central office for mostly internet technology. So understanding the way that these, like you can really, when you start to look, you can kind of see history in action and these like infrastructures sort of building on each other over time. And like noticing that for the first time is just like a whole new world opening up.
That should be your next book, Abandoned Systems.
Oh,
Abandoned systems, right? Yeah, exactly.
It's just nothing but old theme parks.
Well, I'm always fascinated by like abandoned subways.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was like you were talking about the telegraph lines, and you have the map that you drew out here. I guess it was one of those things like once reading it just seemed obvious, like, oh, they laid those lines and then the internet lines and the communication lines, but I guess I just didn't realize that those same pathways were following the same, they follow the same paths. And then the other thing that was kind of you mentioned it in the book, like when you connect to something in, let's say, Europe, I guess I always thought it was going through through space, and it's not. It's through. And then once I realized, I'm like, oh yeah, they always talk about the undersea cables and how it disrupted something, and I'm like, but for some reason, I think everything is wireless, and you take it for granted.
Well, and I think that reason is because of the metaphors that we use as well. When you think about something as a cloud, you're not thinking about it traveling through a wire to like a big building and machines, right? Like you're thinking about like something leaving your phone and just sort of floating up into the atmosphere, and it's there until you need to retrieve it. So I think, part of the fun of using comics for this is that you get to really like show in images these processes and how they work and how different they are from how we talk about them.
I think that's one of the benefits of how you do that, in the sense that you also expose, you excavate the idea that, how we have our systems today is built upon a legacy of decisions made years and years and years ago. And, you could almost sit on any city council meeting or state government and national government meeting, and they'll loudly proclaim that we're not doing anything that is racist or doing anything that is, we're not laying these, we're not putting these roads down with the intent of isolating people but a lot of those decisions were made because of infrastructure that was already put in place. And I think the visual piece of that really kind of opened my eyes to say, well, of course they're not, but this, you're building upon these troublesome legacies that were in place years and years and years ago. And by continuing this, for whatever reason, finances, ease of access, whatever the case may be, those problems continue.
Right. Yeah. It's really remarkable to me just how much we are dealing with like the legacies of somewhat arbitrary decisions that were made, 100 years ago when these systems were first imagined, and we don't even realize now. Sometimes just like how arbitrary or accidental the way things were built were set up.
Recently, I saw a community member pose the suggestion about learning about that kind of history, especially things that have been established as clear, like that was a mistake, like, that was a mistake because it hurt people, or it was, stereotyping people, or, just literally harming them, by exposing them to, let's say, air pollution, those kinds of things, the decision. And they looked at that as like such a negative way of thinking. Why focus on those negatives? I didn't do it. We didn't do it. We're not doing that. Let's be positive and talk about just the wonders. And I wasn't expecting some of those points that you were making in the book. I think I got the book and I thought it would just be more of a fun spin.
Where do
through
the tubes and the wires go?
Yeah, I thought it was going to be like
right.
just diagrams and diagrams. It kind of reminds me when I was a kid, I got the Star Trek Enterprise blueprint, and it was all drawn out so you can see where everything is. There was no, I don't want to say commentary. That's not right, because really the history that you put in here is like the infrastructure of the infrastructure, and I think it's appropriate once I saw it. And the things that I learned when I learned about infrastructure when I was younger, as a child, even things like Modern Marvels on the History Channel was a show I loved. It'd be like, tonight, super dams, It never got into that. It just went into, look at all the awesome we built. Why, I guess, any thoughts on that idea that, like, talking about the mistakes is viewed as, what would you say to someone who say, well, that's just viewing on the focusing on the negative sides, be more positive, be more pro, look at the big dam we made.
Yeah, right. It's a great question. And, I don't want to overlook the benefits that these systems provide. But to me, that's already it is the narrative. It's it's already what we learn. It's the reason these things exist, right? So I come from a social sciences background. And one of the things that I wanted to do is actually, look at some of the implications outside of engineering of these giant systems, particularly in dam building, right? There's no question that it that it's provided a lot of benefits in terms of preventing floods and making water available, but those benefits are very well chronicled. It's what we already learn. This is a chance also to look at some of those other implications that we don't talk about as much in terms of what does it do to ecology? What does it do to the people who lived on these rivers and relied on them sometimes for thousands of years beforehand, and didn't have a say in this? And who gets to make these decisions?
I liked you have what I think is a theme, a couple themes in the book, but the theme was the imagined potentials of things. I think that's a phrase that you used, and that jumped out as me out. And so the argument is presented. I don't think you're making this. Well, you might be making this argument, but I'm making this sound like it's heavy-handed. It's not at all. It was very focused on. You did get to hoorah dams and the internet and everything first, but all of a sudden it was so subtle, I think, that you bring us into those stories those histories. I wrote down some, and this is not a pun, but dam history and some dam facts. I was surprised. From 1920 to 1950, there were 10,000 new dams. And then from 1950 to 1980, 40,000. And 2/3 of the major rivers no longer are free flowing. And I was like, wow. Those things have to be impactful. And even it sort of led into, I wrote down as is there a need for infrastructure and the greed for infrastructure, in which it was remind me a little bit of the dog wagging the tail, or the tail wagging the dog kind of scenario. Some of these scenarios, did we do this for the reason we originally started building in the past, and kind of going down that rabbit hole? It just stirred up so many areas of thinking about those things, and ultimately because it's about not the stuff but the people it serves and the people it affects.
Yeah, and I think that I'm really glad to hear that it just brought up questions for you, and I think this relates to your other point about whether or not I'm trying to make an argument. Clearly, in telling histories are always subjective, and I'm very open about that in the book, right? You could tell the history of any of these three systems and use completely different information, right? Because as a popular historian, picking pieces of information to try to construct a history. My values are in the way that I present this history, but I do also, my main purpose is to present sort of a narrative that will help readers ask these questions and help readers think about both, these systems and other aspects of their life in a different way, in understanding how things came to be and why we sort of maybe keep doing things the same way and other ways that we could potentially go about it.
Obviously, the name of the book is Hidden Systems. So one of the questions I want to ask is, why are they hidden? And then in some ways, too, you have you illuminate what is actually happening with your artwork and in the way you portray it. Would it be better if some of these systems weren't hidden?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in some ways, the systems themselves aren't really hidden, because once you start looking for them, you actually notice them almost everywhere, right? In some ways, it feels like they're hidden just because we take them for granted because we've gotten so used to them. I think one of my favorite parts of doing the research for this book is kind of finding the moments in history where these systems were new and were still marvels for people, like the moment where people turned on electricity for the first time and, had light in their home that wasn't creating smoke, right? Or like the moments in time where like people were amazed that there were aqueducts bringing fresh, clean water into the city when they had only ever drank like dirty water before. Or just like the moments of the early internet too, and just like the wonder that was expressed in being able to communicate so quickly and easily and visually across space and time. Like, like these are all things that become invisible over time because we take them for granted. So part of what I was trying to do in here is not just show them physically, but also kind of bring us back to maybe the wonder of that the systems really should still be inspiring in us.
And I think there's actually like some architectural design that now exposes some of these systems. I think about like, just nothing's put in under plaster anymore. A lot of things are just out in the open, and some of that's for convenience, of course, but I think there's an aesthetic to certain industry that kind of wants that out in the open, and it's almost their decoration.
Yeah.
And it would be, it's a great opportunity to think about public art in general. Like infrastructure always, because we don't really notice it, sort of creates this like negative space in our surroundings. If you think about like power lines and electrical boxes, and I think we are seeing people see these as like sites for public art and like sort of drawing attention to them. And I've been excited to see that.
But that brings up another point. I think we saw public works of yesteryear that were looked at as not only engineering, but perhaps architectural marvels. I don't think we see that as much now. I think it's more utilitarian.
It depends. Like, certainly there's some, I'm thinking some of the train stations in New York, for example,
right.
That new one is like this art piece and stuff. I think they try, but
are we coming back to that maybe?
Yeah, I think that it is interesting to look at the intersection of art and engineering and architecture in that way. And I go into that a little bit in the book about this sort of movement of precisionism in the mid 1900s that like, it was this painters and photographers that were looking at the industrial landscape and like trying to see it as art. And some of them were commissioned in the New Deal era in order to like, sort of bring out the artful nature of what was being built.
Speaking of artful nature, we always like, since this is a science education podcast, to know sometimes how our guests got to be in the position they're in, doing the work they're doing. Starting with grade school, high school, wherever you were, how did you get to this work, this profession, I guess?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I came kind of from a social sciences background. I studied political science and journalism in college, and I was really interested in finding like ways of just like making concepts, and particularly like academic concepts, more accessible. And I became interested in like I said, the infrastructure, just because it felt like something that comics were so well suited to bring to our attention in a way that we don't see in our normal lives. But I hadn't studied science in a long time, so it involved me like kind of refreshing my memory on a lot of the things that like I learned in high school. Like I remember trying to like really understand how electricity worked and like reaching out to my high school science teacher and being like, can you go over this again? Because that's actually like, as an adult, I'm not sure I fully understand what electricity is and how it works. And I got one of those like...
what do you mean electrons are moving?
Yeah, right. And I got one of those like, high school science kits where I could like wire up, little lights with batteries and things like that to like kind of teach myself these concepts again.
Okay.
So I think that for the most part, I'm coming to this as someone who just like, as an adult, really still loves to learn. I think a lot of adults still really love to learn. And I often use my comics as a way for me to be learning about things.
So it's sort of, your comics are operating as like a note-taking tool then? Would you say that?
I think in some ways, especially in the first drafts, like I take notes. Note-taking is like visual note taking is a big part of my process, and a lot of the pages sort of emerge out of that process.
You have some pictures,
and there's lots of drafts from there, but yeah.
Yeah, you have some pictures in the back of the book. Is that what that is, like first drafts and things like that?
Yeah, first drafts and notes, a lot of sketches.
I think there even was one on a napkin or something like that, or something.
Yeah. And in general, just like the idea of like doodling and like sketching and playing around with images while I'm reading something or watching documentaries has a big part in what ends up in the book, I think.
So you said that you do some teaching right now, right?
Yes.
How do you incorporate what you've learned from doing this book into your class, and how do you do that?
Yeah, so I teach a class.
I'm assuming the answer is yes, by the way.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I teach a class on comics history, so very different than infrastructure, but I think that I use a similar approach in teaching where it's, sort of looking at things from a bird's eye perspective and trying to like understand concepts as opposed to just like specific dates or specific pieces of information, and figuring out how things fit together. The role of, for instance, in comics history, right? Like you can look at like the main figures in comics history, or you can look at the communities that like helped these figures come up. You can look at sort of what was going on in the culture at the time, the way that production and distribution all affected what was made. So again, sort of looking at the more counterintuitive aspects of history, I feel like is where all the interesting stuff is.
So now, if you've done these things as a way to help yourself learn, but also help teach concepts with the book, and as science teachers, Dale and I think both reveled in the fact that, this would have been perfect for us to use teaching this concept in the classroom, for instance. And textbook is not as a physical kind of construct as it used to be. But have you thought about expanding this into the textbook world, drawing illustrations for science classes and such?
Yeah, I really love going into classrooms. It is something that I do with this book and with these concepts, and particularly in a way that like allows students to draw and to use drawing as a way of learning, even if they feel like maybe they're not artists. I do think that like we live in a very visual culture. Everyone is, using memes, everyone's using emojis, like everyone knows how to communicate visually. And one of the things that I really love doing is like going in and just bringing out those skills that students are often already using, but don't think of themselves as artists, and helping them sort of use art as a way of understanding different science concepts, different social concepts, and things like that. And yes, the book has only been out for a month, but I would love to see it being used in classrooms and curriculums, hopefully with the goal of not just like educating students about these systems, but like encouraging them to ask questions in a way that I think the book advocates for.
You know what I want is posters of some of these. Like expand some of these into big wall charts. Like I think they'd serve both purposes, inspire questions, but also just have a nice look to them.
Yeah, I think that, what I'm doing with the book is, it is called a graphic novel, and it is a comic, but it brings in a lot of elements of poster design and children's book design and just graphic design in general. Comics are really a hybrid medium in that way, where you can bring in a lot of different kinds of visual communication and put them all on the page together.
Did you have training to become a comic? Is it can I become a comic? Is it something I have to, a skill I learn, or do I have to have something to start with?
I think,
or is that a hard, impossible question to answer?
Yeah, no, I think anyone can do this. Like I said, I think that like, if you can draw an emoji, right, like, which everyone can do, right, like you can communicate visually, and I do a lot of workshops about that and try to, encourage people to think and to communicate in comics. I think that, maybe around the age of 12, a lot of young people start to think like, I'm either an artist or I'm not an artist, right?
Yeah.
Like young kids like don't have any inhibition when it comes to drawing. Like they'll just go for it. And And it's really sad to see a lot of people discouraged from this kind of visual communication, because I think comics can be a really useful tool for anyone to communicate, like especially teachers. I think it's really useful. So I think that you can do it, absolutely.
But there's got to be some tricks to it, or not tricks, but like certain things you can learn, like, when making a face, do this, not this, so you can, or perspective or something like that.
Yeah, totally. And so like I did go to school for comics.
Oh, okay.
Like I live in Vermont now.
School?
I went to comic school. It's a school called the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction.
Yeah.
So that's actually where I teach now.
You must have the best T-shirts of any school out there.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, we're all a bunch of toonies.
What kind of program is that then? How long does that take?
Yeah, so it's an MFA program. It's a 2-year program, and it's unlike other art schools that might have like a comics program. Like, it's small classes, and everyone that comes to the school like just works on comics for like 1 year or 2 years. It's a 1 year or 2 year program, and it really is about like sort of understanding this visual language of comics, the grammar of it, the tricks of it, the formal elements of how to tell a story, how to lead the eye across a page, and pushing the medium in different directions. It's still, comics is a really exciting medium, and that there's still a lot of things that haven't been done with it. And there's a lot of really great work coming out of the school. And that's where this book started, was it came out of my work as a student at the program.
And you
I
kind of
envision the title for this podcast as "Do you want to go to comic school?" No,
Do you want to go to comic school? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So with that in mind, and you said you learned some tricks there. You have all these hidden system symbols. What concept was the hardest to illustrate in the book?
I think electricity.
What you have to take the most liberties with?
Yeah, I think electricity is like, as far as all of the systems, I mean, really just electricity is magic. I mean, it's so hard to describe. And I felt a little better knowing that the people who like really like invented the electric grid and like these early electrical devices also had no idea what electricity was. They just like were observing it working. But it wasn't until much later that people
Post A goes here, post B goes here.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So
I think you even have some winks and nods in the text about just like, stay with me. It's not magic, but it kind of is magic. And
it kind of is magic.
Yeah.
That one page on what electricity is, and trying to show sort of the way that, it's a field. And, like the difference between like current and like voltage, like there's just a lot of like nuances to it that I think was hard to not sort of gloss over when presenting visually. And I'm hoping I struck that balance in an okay way.
Yeah, I mean, I taught this. I'm a high school physics teacher, and I would struggle with that all the time, because every illustration you make has a yes, but, essentially associated with it. But, it's not like really like this. But for now, let's just say it's this, okay? And you're kind of following along. And then, like, 2 concepts later, you have to contradict that drawing. Well, now we're going to look at it from this perspective.
Right, yeah. And, there's a lot of things that I wanted to convey that I learned that I was super interested in. And just, like, the idea of, like, the force of electricity, and, like, I mean, this is like really technical, but the need for like VARs on the electric grid, and like something that like allows power to like actually move through like this great amount of space, and like how that relates to like efforts to like put more solar panels and wind turbines on the grid that don't create that kind of force or inertia that older power plants did. And like these like really, one thing that I was really trying to convey too is just like the force of electricity that we don't necessarily think about, and like how much power is like really needed to power the electric grid.
Yeah, I always like tell my students, like, imagine you had to herd a huge group of rabbits through a forest. Now, what about that forest would make that easier or more difficult? And they're like, all right, the forest is all my electrons.
That's a great.
All my rabbits
metaphor.
are electrons.
Yeah,
because they're moving around.
I should draw that out.
Yes, there you go. Yeah,
Dan, I noticed that in the book you're pretty sparse with colors. You have black and you have shades of blue. They're red does come up when you're talking about pollutants and toxins. Did you have to stick to a certain color palette? Did you? Was that part of the aesthetic there? What were the choices you had to make there?
Yeah, for me, the sparse color is really just about sort of like the ease of movement through the page and creating hierarchy. So I really wanted to kind of rely on the line artwork and rely on the drawings to convey that, and leave plenty of white space for sort of the eye to move through the page. I experimented with adding more colors, and like the last chapter does have more colors, but I still keep it pretty light because I felt that like when you're including a lot of really big, vibrant colors, it can be distracting. And there's already just so much information in this book that the last thing I want to do is like overwhelm the reader with like colors.
I thought it was like an intentional thing because the last chapter has the green. Well, it's got tan, but it's got the more green. And I thought, well, is this because the water is, contributes so much to life? Was that the goal, or is that just a happy accident, or kind of how it worked out?
No. I mean, in the same way that the book sort of like expands its focus from like this sort of like more recent history of the internet to like basically human history in water. Like I think tried to make the artwork a little bit more expansive and all encompassing as well, and to include a broader color scheme in it.
Where do you do it? How is it? Where do you do it? How is it drawn? Like it's done. You mentioned your actual doodles or actual drawings and drafts first, but is it done? When does it become digital?
Yeah, so I
see some on the background hanging on your wall there. Is that part of the process, or?
Yeah, so I mean, I really love to draw, and most of the process of making this book was just drawing on paper. Earlier drafts are done with like, a mechanical pencil on printer paper, something kind of like cheap and disposable because I'm, going through hundreds of pages and coming up with some of these images. And then I draw all these pages were drawn in ink on Bristol board, like a heavy cardstock paper. After many drafts, many revisions, and then I scan that into the computer and usually color it and letter it in Photoshop and InDesign.
Wow.
So there's comics are sometimes a clumsy process, and there's always like each of these pages went through as many as a dozen drafts before.
Yeah, so like a page like these each panel sort of. Are you drawing this whole thing at once, or each little section, or does it depend?
Yeah, they're all drawn at once. So it's all it's all drawn in black ink, and then I go in and I change the color of the line artwork to sort of create that hierarchy, and try to make it as easy as possible to move through.
How long does like a page take then?
The longest part is like the research and like organizing the concepts. So like it often really kind of feels like comics puzzles, right? Like I'm trying to figure out how to like piece all these concepts together in a way that like kind of flows together.
I could see like that's maybe why you have some hanging paper. You're just moving them around.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So like the pages themselves are kind of like puzzles. I'm trying to get the pages to fit together in the right order, and then I'm also trying to get the panels on each page to fit together in the right order. So I generally think about page spreads at a time because I know that's how a reader is going to be absorbing the book. So usually I think about 2 pages at a time. They don't take that long to make final art for once I already have it planned out. Like it might take like a day or two to draw the final art and color it. But it's the process of like figuring out what goes on those pages and doing the research and keeping track of sources and editing and finding just the right words. Because I don't have a lot of space in each of these panels. Really, it's like the word choice that I'm like, sometimes spending like a whole night just like wrestling with one sentence that I can't get.
That was right. Is that a separate script, or is that the words being added to the drawings?
It's a combination of both. Sometimes the art comes first, sometimes the words come first. I try to do a mix of both so that it's not just me illustrating something that I've written.
Yeah, that's Dan, fascinating.
You have as your topics here, like the internet, so both wired and wireless, electricity, basically. There's a couple pieces in there, pollution toxins, and then moving water. What systems didn't make the cut, or what are the hidden systems?
Still hidden.
Yeah, great question. So like I originally was going to include a whole chapter on waste in this book.
But
I initially pitched it. I was just like that would work great. Doesn't connect quite as well to the other 3 chapters, and then it took me a lot longer to make this book than I ever would have imagined. And I realized the book was already getting very long, so that could definitely be a separate book. I think I think I could use this approach to talk about so many different things. My sort of idea for a follow would probably be on sort of the process of making and moving and reusing things, like what are the materials that like our computers are made out of, right? Like everything is like basically made out of rocks or plants, right? Like how does it get from rocks and plants to like all the things around us, and like how does it get to us, and what happens when we're done with it? So like sort of the consumerist system and the product system and how things are built, I think is something that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I always think about the stamp like made in America, for instance, and I'm like, is it really made, or are we just assembling it in America? And what does that all mean? Because there's, even car companies, so much American made is really Canada or Mexico.
It's a big thing with the EV credit right now for electric vehicles. They just I think it's Hyundai, and there's 2 plants that are opening up in U.S. just so they can get the made or assembled in America tax credit.
Yeah, I mean, I think iPhones and smartphones are a perfect example of this. And I did some work for a comic on this before, and it's so fascinating to look at like the supply chain of like an iPhone, for instance, and like seeing that like the minerals and raw resources required to make it come from like 100 different countries, and they're all shipped around the world and made into these small pieces that are then assembled in other places. And Apple is kind of just like a branding put on this device. So
sort
like
of an overseer, keep doing.
Yeah, like the supply chains and like how many parts are involved and like all of the things around us, I think is a really fascinating hidden system.
Well, and
that
as
we
you
also
mentioned,
don't realize until it breaks.
Yes, and so not a lot of people thought about supply chain until recently when it wasn't working the way we had intended.
Well, and that's a theme of your book too, is that balance of we really start learning about all these infrastructures when they go wrong. It reminds me of I just watched Bob's Burgers. You guys ever watch that cartoon? Bob's Burgers, and the son walks by with a plunger and he goes, "You got anything bigger than this?" And it's like, your kids don't understand toilets until they need to understand toilets.
Right.
So it's like
exactly.
all that kind of stuff for there. Is there, you kind of talked about this a little bit, you start seeing it all the time, and that reminds me of the old like FedEx logo, where once you see the arrow in the logo, you guys know what I'm talking about, the arrow in the logo.
Yes.
Once you see it, you can't not see it. Are you like haunted by certain things that you learned about infrastructure from this whole process that you like are just always there, and like your friends are like, we get it.
Now I need to look up the FedEx logo.
Yeah, right.
You don't know the FedEx logo?
I do now.
Yeah, there's an arrow. It's always
You can't unsee it now.
Yep.
No, I mean, I think all these things are the same way. Like the process of working on this book really was like developing a way of seeing in so many ways. And like when my power goes out now, like I'm thinking about like, okay, where in the grid is this problem happening? Is it just like a breaker in the local network that needs to be flipped? I mean, but that's really the goal, right? Like, I think this book so easily could have just been a book about like the time systems went wrong, right? And it would have been like very dramatic and right, like these. But those are already the times that we're already hearing about in the news, right?
Yeah.
Like, current events cover when systems break. They don't cover how they exist otherwise, right? And like, in order for us to understand them when something goes wrong, we need to actually understand them when they're like, quote unquote, working.
I feel there's a lot of people in hard hats going, "Thank you." Like, we've been here all the while.
It's so fun talking to people who work on these systems.
Sure.
And they're happy to talk about it too, right? Because, I think generally people that work on the water systems or the electric grid, like really do want people to understand them and understand like the work that goes into maintaining all of this.
I just watched a Veritasium. Did you ever see the Veritasium YouTube videos? We've had him on the show. And he just did a whole thing on concrete. and like how much. Actually, this would be kind of what you talked about the elements that make up anything. He shows like the different like a bar graph of the different elements in the, you know, how much of this element is used, and then like, you know, like different manufacturing elements, not the actual elements. But so like steel, well, that's this much, and then it goes concrete, and it's just like off the chart, like how much concrete we use for everything that surrounds us. And then he does this whole thing about how it's made, and I was like, this is a hidden system. We're literally walking on it all the time. But during that video, there's like the concrete truck drivers are sitting there, you know, talking about it, and you can almost see their face like, yeah, we deal with this all the time, you know, of course you got to do this. Like they carry like soda with them, 2-liter bottles of soda. And I remember my brother-in-law who drove cement truck or concrete trucks talking about that. Like if it hardens, or if you're worried that you're not going to make your delivery on time, one of the things they do is dump in 2-liter bottle of soda because the sugar will keep it going before it solidifies. And I was like, this is Dan's next chapter.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, that's a big goal of the book, is just to like establish this idea of a hidden system and like help people, whether or not, you know, it's one of the 3 systems covered in the book, like help people understand that there are these things everywhere. Like I read an article about the cold chain, like the series of like refrigerated trucks and refrigerated warehouses that keep things cold all the way from like, you know, growing vegetables all the way into our like home fridges, and right, like how much we take that for granted. You know, there's so many things like this. And I'm hoping that that's sort of what gets across.
Definitely. We really appreciate it. I think the book was informative, but it was really an eye-opening experience. It was like, it just changed me. It just changes you to look when you're walking around. It really does. It was more of like you know, kind of like taking the you know, like when they reveal a new automobile or something, they pull the blanket off and you're like, oh, you know, it's like it was there all the while. So we really appreciate it. Looking forward to seeing whatever you do next.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, this has been a pleasure. So much fun to talk with you guys.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for listening to our show. If you'd like to know more about this episode or any of our previous episodes, visit laboutloud.com. Lab Out Loud is produced by me, Dale Basler, and my co-host, Brian Bartell. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for Lab Out Loud, visit laboutloud.com/contacts. Thanks again.